patterns and examples, and we'll look at some boards in the wild, and then we'll close out with some takeaways that hopefully you can use to set up a board and start doing something effective with your team today, or improve the board that you have. Alrighty, so Kanban. Visualizing work fits into the overall flow of the overall concepts of Kanban in software as really the first step. It's the jumping off point for most teams that are getting started with Kanban. And the idea behind visualizing work, and this becomes really important, is that you want to be visualizing the work as you are doing it when you start, meaning your initial Kanban board, your first iteration of your Kanban board for your team, is not aspirational and it's not prescriptive. You're not telling your team this is the process we want you to follow. Even if you've already decided that you want to change your process and you have had meetings and you've discussed what you want to change your process to, that's not what goes on your board when you put up your first board. I think that kind of ties back to respecting your team. You start the board by talking about where you are right now, and then you make incremental improvements together as a team. You decide where the highest priority items are. It could be that if you've been in the process of changing how you want work to flow through, you may already kind of be doing this, right? So the important thing is you want to start with something that is some kind of accurate measure of truth. It reflects what you're doing today. And if you want to change your processes, great. Do that in parallel with the Kanban board. So you put up the Kanban board with your current state, and then you say, our desired state here is that we want to get to this goal, and then you incrementally change stuff on the board and bring your team along with it. I say this because it doesn't help to put up a board that doesn't reflect reality or that people have no idea how to use. That's going to just decrease the amount of sort of buy-in and cooperation that you get in using the board. So that's the first thing. After you've visualized work, there are a number of steps that you then bring in again incrementally, like making policies explicit, definitions of done. We're going to talk about that very briefly today. Limiting work in process. We have a whole other hour-long talk that focuses on techniques for limiting work in process and the value, showing how that really does improve your productivity overall and the delivery of value. You want to focus on, and you can start doing this right away, focus on flowing work through the system smoothly. Even if you don't know exactly how to do that, you want to look at that and think a goal is really to keep things moving. And then as always in Kanban, you should be committing to continuously improving your system. And having a big board that everybody's looking at every day, that everybody's engaging with, gives everybody an opportunity to weigh in with things that they think can make that process better. So that's really where your starting point is. Definition of a big visible display. Large display, yeah, you can see that. The things that kind of pop out there are the critical team information. So team is an important concept here. It should be a board that reflects the work of the whole team, a unit, whatever that is. It should be critical information. It should be information that is meaningful and important to them to do their daily jobs. It's not. You can have a board outside the manager's office that tells some kind of a manager's story and that you want the team to know about. That is also a good information radiator, nothing wrong with it. It won't be the thing the team uses to control their work. You can have lots of different boards that tell lots of different stories. So in some ways, just the idea of visualizing information is by itself valuable. But in terms of working it into Kanban and using it to make your software delivery more effective, we're really focused on how are we visualizing the work that the team is doing. So that's what critical information kind of is about for me. Continuously updated. I'm going to reiterate this at the end. I just changed one of the slides at the end to put that in there and make it even stronger. Your team should be interacting with it and changing things on the board on a regular basis. If you have a board that doesn't change very often, you aren't using the Kanban board most effectively. And finally, located where the team can see it constantly. This ends up being, interestingly enough, an argument against electronic boards, although electronic boards are really, really popular, and they're being built into lots of, the new version of Visual Studio, Team Foundation Server, has built-in boards now, and there's lots of third-party tools that you can get, and, the Atlassian suite has built-in boards, and the thing is, Those can be helpful, and they do become a lifeline for distributed teams if you're not all in the same physical location. So electronic may be the place that the team can see it constantly, but if you have a co-located team, all or part, there's really no substitute for having a physical board physically present in their location. There are some things you can do with that you just cannot do with even a brilliantly coded electronic board. So keep in mind kind of the trade-offs that you're making as you choose between those things. Here's some, you heard me steal one of these words already in the presentation: information radiator, visual management, wall chart, task board, any number of things that you can call them. The point is, it's a great big visualization of the work that your team is doing. A good big visual display. These are the things we just kind of went over. You want it to tell the story of your team's work. You want it to be easily visible. Living means stuff is moving through the board and that it changes. If it never changes, people see no reason to look at it all the time, and then they're not looking at it. You do want to keep it simple. You don't want anybody to need to step closer to understand what's on the board. You want them to be able to get an overview and understand, I guess it ties back to the story. What are you trying to overall tell with the board? We'll see this in an example that's coming up. And self-explanatory. So you want it to, you don't need a great big legend that explains everything that's on the board. You can kind of get the gist of it. So here are some good signs. These are nice board smells, right? These are things that that indicate to you that you're doing the board well. And I think the bottom line I'll let you just leave it up there, let y'all look at it. I think what these all distill down to is if people are looking at it and you can tell that they are reacting to the information that's on it and that it clearly has value to them, you're doing it correctly. That's it. All of those things boil down to that. And so that includes your team members, but it also includes other stakeholders within your organization. I really like the pattern of a Kanban board where you actually have it facing out from your team's workspace so that people in the hallway are able to see it and, in fact, kind of have to see it, can't not see it. And they're reacting and interacting with it, and they see that things are moving constantly, and it gives a sense of the team being productive in a way that walking by and seeing a bunch of developers with headphones on does not give the same sense of movement, right? Even though if you know developers, you know that's when they're most productive. The point is you see stuff happening there. And if you have folks outside your team who are able to witness your team interacting with the board, that's also an exciting thing because it shows the teamwork, it shows that the board is useful, it may give people an idea that that board is a useful tool that they could use with their teams, and it gives the other stakeholders, your managers, upper level folks that are over your team, an understanding that your team is doing important work and that they care about it. All of that is really cool to me. Alrighty, this is us. This is Northwest Cadence. This is our Kanban board in our office. Aren't we cute? So here we are, and we're all standing around the board, and we're having a conversation about the work that's underway. It's a good illustration as well of the fact that it's more than just developing software, because we don't actually write all that much software at Northwest Cadence. We do a little bit, but most of what we do is client engagements and talks, things like this. Trips, consulting. So we have work that's being done that's represented on those little cards. And we have a process that it flows through our system, and this is it. We've actually spent the entire last quarter working on refining the board, talking to each other about how we use it and what different stakeholders in different columns want to see in terms of definitions of done. So we're really ready and trying to take our board to the next level. We also, the company's really proud of this board because it's just cool. It's made with blackboard paint and magnetic paint layered on each other, and the little cards are magnets, and we had a lot of fun building it. So that's another thing that you can kind of consider is what all it's made of. At its simplest level, you get a bunch of Post-it notes out of the stockroom and you stick them on a whiteboard because they stick really well to whiteboards, and draw some lines with the whiteboard marker and you're good. But you can make it as fancy as you would like, and we had a lot of fun making ours fancy. So this is where we talk a little bit again about putting up boards that represent the truth. The idea is that this is the purpose of the board is to make sure that folks understand what's really truly going on. And one of the things that can be a challenge that really can be a stumbling block for teams that are first starting out with Kanban and trying to visualize their work is the resistance to put up bad news, the resistance to put up facts that they think might portray the team in a negative light. And also it's just all of the things that go into you're not quite sure you want to put the real truth up on a board that people can see. And so this is meant to be my pep talk to encourage you to bite the bullet and do that anyway, even though it is very scary. Because it's the only way you're really going to improve, for one thing. It's the only way the team is going to respect the information on the board, is if it's really true. Even if they initially are resistant to it because they are afraid it might make them look bad. There is a step that, and I'm going to assume that folks that are on this call are somewhere in there. We've got folks that are at least thought leaders, within their organization, or the ones that are driving for change. Hi, guys. Or, managers who are interested in how can we make this work for the team. So I'm going to talk to you guys that are in any kind of a leadership role or are trying to bring your teams along. This becomes important. Of course, it is very critical to put the truth on the board, and so you've got to look at yourselves and be courageous about what you're willing to let yourself say about your work with your team. So the first step is you want to put yourselves out there. The second step is you've got to make it safe for your teams to tell the truth on the board to you and to the people above you. And so you do have to make sure, as you're encouraging a developer, to be honest about the fact that something is blocked or late or broken and being reworked. To really expose those things, you do have to create a culture where folks are not punished for telling the truth. And sometimes that's just hard because you want to have accountability for making bad decisions, doing things wrong. You've got to come together as a team and say, okay, fine, it's over now. How do we solve it? Now, if you have team members that really, truly are not getting the job done and you really, truly are not getting the right attitude, you have a bigger problem that is not about the board. So by the time we get here, I assume that you have basically the team you need to have with basically decent, good people on it that are trying to do their jobs. So with that in mind, when they're putting difficult truths about the team's work on the board, it shouldn't be about blaming anybody. It should be about a sense of urgency of fixing the overall situation. How did this come to be? We know that you're a good worker and that you are basically trying to do a good job. So what has prevented that from happening and how do we solve it? So there's an important that's that closing loop to make sure that the brutal honesty is there, it's important, and it should be rewarded with a solution to the problem at least. And it shouldn't be punished. If you start punishing people for putting bad news on the board, obviously they're going to stop doing it, and then you won't have value out of the board. If you find that your board's not aligning to truth, that might be a place to look. Alrighty. Again, I want to invite anybody who may have questions as we're going along. If you're trying to do this, if you're finding any challenges, if it resonates with you or not, let me know in the IM panel, and I'll work those into the presentation or address any questions that you have. Okay, here, if you've seen my Intro to Kanban presentation or the Scrum versus Kanban presentation, I use this same slide in both of those because I really like it. The first thing that I like about this is that we can look and get a basic idea of what this team is doing and where they're at with it, even though the cards do not actually say real words on them. Well, they do. I think they're in Latin. They have Laura Ipsum Dolor on them. So we can get a quick high-level overview of this board, and even though I talk about the big legend at the bottom of the board, that wouldn't be up in the room where the board lives. That big legend would be the sort of thing that people would understand as your team guidelines. I guess maybe it would be up, but it wouldn't have to be. So if you imagine that this whole legendy bit down at the bottom isn't there, you can still look at the board and get a reasonable sense of what stuff means there. And then if you do take the step closer and you see, oh yeah, well, we've got this red one, and you zoom in on the little tiny red square. Wait, let me point at it. The little tiny red square here, even if it's not immediately obvious what a red square is, if you look in there and it has, blocked because somebody's on vacation, and you say, oh, that means they're not working on it, they're waiting. You get it, right? So you've got big story here, people working on tasks that are related to that story. This one is blocked and not being worked on. These ones are done. Okay, that's not all that hard to understand. There's a lot of refinement that then happens in this board, and so I use this board to talk through the different steps of implementing other Kanban techniques. We've got the limited work in process up here at the top. We've got a sense of pulling work through the system instead of pushing work in on each subsequent role. We have an idea of overall the team is flowing work through and getting stuff into production one at a time as quickly as possible. And all of those are other Kanban techniques, but the important part for today's presentation is the idea that this board tells your team's story. The other thing I talk about in the intro is that I do want to emphasize here as well is that the steps at the top that the team goes through, the stages that the work goes through to be considered done, and the scope of work that belongs to this team, they depend. So you don't start out with these headers and say we go through these states unless that actually is exactly what your team is doing right now. So these are going to be quite different. You may have a lot more columns, a lot fewer columns. They may be arranged differently. And we're just about to kick off the section where I'm going to talk about some different board patterns and try to give you some creative ideas for visualizing what is, in most places in the real world, a fairly complex process, right? If it was really, really easy, you might not even need a board to visualize it. But because we're doing a lot of different things at once, we have teams working on things that are broken down into bits and need to come together at a particular time. We have some complex needs, and that's what the strength of this Kanban board really is. It's flexible enough to accommodate a lot of different work streams and work styles and evolve over time and really tell your story. So a couple more highlights for those of you who maybe have not seen those presentations. We've got, of course, the fun avatars. I really, really recommend that you represent your team members because you want to have something on the board that says who's working on what. Representing your team members in a fun way, obviously not in a mean way, but, you know, in a fun way that the team enjoys. Making little custom South Park avatars that look like your team members. I found that super fun. You can have folks bring in pictures, have them draw little self-portraits, something, have them bring in a picture that their kid drew of them. Whatever it is, you do kind of want it to be something that is recognizable as that person, at least within your team. So maybe they have a cartoon or an avatar or, you know, their favorite superheroes, you know, chest logo or whatever it is. You want to have some sense of you can glance at the board and remember who's who. If it's excessively complicated to remember who's who, that you may have overthought it a little bit. Then you would encourage them to put those up as decorations in at their desk, and you use something else that looks more like them on the board. Okay. So we got the South Park avatars. I talked through a little bit of the idea of a task breakdown in this area. We've got individual doing and done columns. Those are really a key component of limiting work in process, and I'm not going to spend a particular amount of time talking about those today. We're really going to stay focused on visualization. This is where we have our making policies explicit. In this case, it's our definitions of done. What does the team agree that done means in these situations? And these are opportunities as well if you have a stage gate or a mandatory review or some compliance need that you have to have represented on the board. You might choose to put that in a spot like this. And overall work flowing across the board. They've got some extra stuff with little dates, I think some in and out dates or priority, you know, date added, hard deadline. Those aren't necessarily important components to the board. If you don't find that data valuable, don't bother putting stuff on it. You know, don't put stuff on the card that your team doesn't need or doesn't use. That'll help you keep it simple and keep the stuff focused on what the team wants to know. All right. Moving on, we're going to talk a little bit now about different board patterns. And so as we get into this section, I want to talk kind of about what I think it means to be a pattern. I'm intentionally using that word from development. My background before joining Northwest Cadence was that I was a programmer for 10 and a half years, a lot more than that actually, but my most recent job I was 10 years at. And we spent a lot of time trying to learn about development patterns. And of course, that's a big deal in coding land. And one of the things that can be kind of a struggle for folks that are first learning patterns, because I've been through that process, is that you learn something like the adapter pattern or the, you know, inversion of control pattern, and it seems really cool, and now you've got this awesome hammer, and you come back to your code and you start looking for nails. You know, where can I use this? I like this pattern, where can I use it? And the moment you've started doing that, you're not really doing patterns the way patterns are meant to be. Patterns are evolutionary. They are things that you discover in problems that you already have that you need to solve. So you don't go looking for a place to apply a particular pattern because you saw that it helped somebody else. Patterns are a language that we use to say, in a given problem situation, here's a way that people have solved similar problems that may be useful to you if you have this problem. That's true in code. It's not that you say, I need to have an inversion of control pattern. I'm going to go find a dependency injector because I objectively ought to have one. Instead, you say, I seem to have an issue in my program that when I run startup, I have an awful lot of things that have to go in exactly the right order. And if they're not in place at the right time, stuff breaks, and we're breaking stuff all the time. I actually had that. And so as soon as we found out that people had solved that problem of startup sequence and stuff being in the right order and circular dependencies at startup, people have had that problem in programming, and they solved it by identifying a pattern, and then they used this particular method to solve it. Now we are speaking a language we can use. We say, oh, I have this problem, and this is what's used to solve a problem that is like that. So, sorry, that was your 3 minutes of programming. Sorry about that. Patterns is a good metaphor, is a good concept that we can also use in process. And in particular, we're going to use it with our displays today. So you shouldn't look at any of the patterns I'm about to show you and say, that one's pretty, I want that one. The thing that would make you do that is if you look at it and you say, that looks like my team's work. That looks familiar to me. I think my team works this way. That would be an example of a pattern being useful because you're saying it reflects what we already have. So these are some different ways of visualizing different types of work streams, and I'll try to point out the situations that might give rise to wanting to use a pattern like this. So we're just starting with, and you'll see the link at the bottom of the page, these all come to us from a site called Tools for Agile. They're just screenshots. So here we have a basic linear flow, and it's really got a lot of similarities to the board that we just looked at, right? We've got our not started queue. We go through various states. We have various limits on work in process. So, for example, we've got a code review state here, and we don't want stuff to sit waiting for review for very long. So we're moving stuff all the way through, analyzing it, building it, verifying it, getting it ready to deploy it, and deploying it. Pretty much everybody in the world is going to develop software roughly that way. Is it useful to you to break it down to that number of columns? Maybe more, maybe fewer for your team. We notice that teams, when they're first getting started, oftentimes have a lot of columns, 10, 15, 20 different columns that they think represent these really important states. And that may be so. But you guys can think as a team about, the process of building stuff. There's probably a lot of little sub-steps that happen in here. The question is it valuable to the entire team to know exactly the detail, how this piece of sausage gets made? Or do you want the team that is the folks that are working in this column to have some flexibility to do what they need to do depending upon the story? So it could be that build is a level of granularity that is absolutely adequate for your team. Stephen Borg, one of our consultants at Northwest Cadence, and he's really well known as a speaker about Kanban, likes to say that eventually all boards devolve into to do, doing, and done. Because by the time you get there, your team is communicating so effectively that that's really all you need to know. I'm not completely sure that that's true. It certainly doesn't need to be your goal. So anyway, straightforward, simple linear flow. We're visualizing, similar to the last board, who's working on stuff, what stuff is blocked, what is the stuff called. This is a tool, so it's got lots of little buttons on it, and we've got a past due flag. So there's just little facts about it that are interesting to know. We have an expedite here that's got a red header, so we know we're moving that one through as quickly as we can. We'll look at some a little bit more complex boards. Okay, so this is a zoom in on a sub-state board. So on our previous board, we had a single column for analysis. And this is where, if we're part of a larger organization, the place where a state and sub-state board may come into play would be if you have a lot of sub-teams that roll up into being a larger overall team. What you may need to have is actually two sets of boards. One would be for each individual work team. And in this case, what we're looking at is a zoom in on work that an analysis team or a design team might be doing. And their internal process is very important and meaningful to them as a sub-team, but to the broader team outside of the analysis group, they really only care that the analysis team as a whole has this thing right now. So again, this is how you would manage that you are working as part of a larger group and then breaking it down into smaller subgroups. The subgroup would use this subboard here to manage their work. So maybe they have one whiteboard that they use, and then the higher level team has a board that looks more like the one we just saw, where it has a single column for analysis. In this kind of an electronic tool, you can have these state and substate boards automatically roll up to each other. Obviously, if you're doing them by hand, you're going to need a sneakernet component where stuff is changing probably daily, maybe even every few hours on your subboard. And then as stuff comes out of the analysis team and moves on to whatever the next team is, somebody at the higher level is going to be updating the overall analysis board and saying this column is now, we're done with this and the next team's accepted that work. Hopefully that makes sense. So again, this is not necessarily anything that would be useful to your team. It just depends on how you're organized. None of these boards are things that you need to aspire to necessarily, but if you see me or if you hear me describing a situation that sounds like your work stream, this might be a tool that would help you manage the work stream the way you have it. All right, doing and done. So here's a little bit of what we saw in the South Park board. Within the build team, we've got a subboard that is simple. It just rolls down to doing and done. The reason that you might do this is the same as it is on the South Park board, and it relates to this limit of work in process. So the build team only wants to have on their plate 3 things at any given time, and stuff doesn't move out of this done column until whoever's next in line is ready to take on that work, whatever the next bit of work is. So it may be that the build team is working really quickly and getting all this stuff done, and all 3 of these things end up in the done column. But because the work in process limit isn't down here on doing, it's up here at build. It means they can only own 3 things. If stuff is not moving out of their done column, it's because the team over here in the void, we don't know who this team is, but perhaps it is a test or a review team. If it's not moving out of this column, it means this team over here is backed up and they don't have capacity to accept more work. And so this is where, okay, we'll do our minute and 30 seconds about limiting work in process. When this happens, if I'm just the build team, I'm going to look at that and say, well, that's a waste of my team's time. We're going to be idle. We're going to be stuck and not doing, you're really telling me we're not going to do any work. But if you look at it from the perspective of the higher level team or the company, organization as a whole, does it make sense to have the build team continue to crank out stuff that the folks next in line from them can't handle already what they were already doing, and so now they're just going to make more of it? Does it make sense for them to do a lot of build if they don't, for example, have the capacity to get it reviewed right away or get it tested right away? Because what happens if it fails a review? Well, it comes right back in here. But does it come right back in here quickly after it's been done, or is it 3 weeks after it's been done because it's been sitting in a queue for all that time? You want to reduce those wait times. You want to get those cycles to be as close together as possible, and the way to do that is to push that work in process limit back through the team. So if your team has all 3 things in done and they are quote-unquote idled because their work in process limit prevents them from accepting new work, what that means is everybody in the team needs to stick their heads up above the cubicle walls and figure out, why are we having a big backup in that next stage in our development, and how do we solve that? Can the dev team do something to solve it? Does the rest of the team need to do something about it? Does it need to be raised up to executives to say, we have a resource constraint here? Is there something else about the way the stories are defined? Whatever it is, the whole team, and in fact the whole company, need to come together to try to solve that problem. Core concept in Kanban, that you would work together to solve the problems of the whole line, not just your little columns in it. And work in process limits just turn out to be a really good tool for forcing you to do that kind of inspection so that you do that. Okay, back up to sort of the bigger team, multiple workflows. So a lot of times when we're working on software development, we might be working on new features and stuff that we're kind of working through a backlog at a nice normal pace, but we may also have to be maintaining an existing system that's in production, and a lot of times that work is the same team doing both of those things. So what that ends up resulting in, and this is a challenge that a lot of teams encounter when they're trying to get started with Scrum, is that you have stuff that pops up that is interruptive, and it needs to be zipped along, it needs to jump the line ahead of the stuff that the team was working on before. It can be difficult to accommodate that in Scrum, although there are lots of tools that will help you do that. You start out the idea of a 2-week sprint, you say, we know what we're going to be doing for the next 2 weeks, and then the very next day something comes up that is different from that, and that's chaos. The team will learn to manage it. But one of the strengths of a more generic Agile or Kanban process is that doesn't have to be a big deal because you don't have a set process for everything else that's being interrupted. Instead, you have a more holistic process that says we have a mix of stuff that is both quick expedite work and everyday work. So this board is a nice example of a way to manage the difference between those two things. You've got your basic work queue here, and from here above this, you've got your regular work that's going through a normal process of analysis, build, test, verification. This is for your new features. And you're doing whatever it is that you need to do testing on new features, acceptance by the users of new features. And then you've got stuff going into deployment. When you have a critical production bug, you might need a different process, not just faster, but possibly a whole different process. And this helps illustrate how you might manage that. So you've got your normal work in process going on up here, and you've got your expedite queue that has just a build the fix, review the code, get it out there. And it's done in a way that makes it really visible, again, visible, really important, makes it really, really easy to visualize that there's something in the expedite queue and that it would take precedence over the stuff in the normal queue. So this can be a really helpful way to manage it. Another thing that's kind of fun to point out about this board is that you can see the team is breaking its own rule. They've got a work in process limit in the expedite queue of 1. We know that's probably not really up to them, right? Although it certainly helps to keep people from loading up the expedite queue with stuff they just think is kind of important. Rather, it's the stuff that truly merits this expedited process. But both of these are legitimate production errors that would come up, and so the team is choosing to break its own rule because they have a good reason. So that's nice. And then it becomes up to the team whether all work on the normal queue goes into a pause mode. If this work in process limit in the normal queue goes down when there's something in expedite, maybe you have an overall limit on in progress of 7, and then normal is usually 7, but it's 6 if there's anything down here. That kind of thing can happen, and it just depends on what makes sense. It could be that you really only need 1 or 2 people to go quickly knock these bug fixes out, and the other 3 or 4 people on your team don't need to be disrupted by the expedite thing, or it could be an all hands on deck situation, and that may depend on the kind of work it is. Either way, you got flexibility. Alrighty. Another pattern that may fit, depending on how your team is organized and does its work, would be that you would have a parallel workflow, meaning that there may be a period in time where a story is in the hands of 2 different teams having different types of things done on it at the same time. And this is a nice example of how that often manifests on teams. We've got one group that's doing front-end design and another group that's doing back-end implementation. And they're going to be working on that stuff in parallel. And then it could be that the definition of done is that they've integrated those 2 things. But there's no reason that they couldn't both be working on it. Now, do you need to track it as parallel, or do you just need to have it be in the build queue and then that team self-organizes? That's up to you. If you're a larger team where maybe even physically the UI, the UX team is somewhere different from the infrastructure team, or whatever, if you're organized in such a way that micro, down to the minute level of communication is not as easy to do, then it might be good to be able to track that this you know, again, maybe like a sub-team owns this part of the story and this group owns this other part of the story. The other thing is, of course, this one might get done sooner and then be waiting on this one. If it's me on this board, I have to say that I would add a column right here for the bringing it back together and integrating it into a single feature. That might be what this team means by done, but that's not clear to me. So I like the idea that you might have this one move into integration and be ready for integration, it'd be sitting there, and then be waiting perhaps on this one while the back-end team is working on something else. So you can see already that I'm taking that and saying, yeah, that's kind of useful, but I might mess with it. You should too. You should look at that and say, that seems a little bit like what we do, but it's not exactly what we do. But now that I'm thinking about exactly what we do, here's how I would change that. So you could own this board and mix it up to reflect what you actually do. It may be that that means you complicate the board quite a bit, and then eventually, again, you simplify it back down again. That's okay too. Go through that process. Alrighty, this one is kind of rolling things back up to a higher level. It's a thing called CONWIP, which stands for Continuous Work in Process Limit. Anyway, the idea was on the previous boards, we saw that, say, the analysis here had a work in process limit, this one had a work in process limit, this one had a work in process limit, and so on. And so the continuous WIP model says, we don't care where it is in this process. We only care that the total of these 4 columns should not exceed 7. And if you're clever, you'll notice that it actually does, and that's because there's a story that's here and here at the same time. And I think that's probably an error, because I wouldn't have the same story in columns this way. I'd use that thing we just saw and have the main columns vertically. I don't know. In any case, the idea is that your team may either start with or move towards having a work in process limit that is not at the column level, but is just at the team and all up level, the overall level, if that's useful for you. The risk there is that if it's not as granular as you need it to be, then if you have individual blockages here that are creating queuing and resources are out of balance, this might make it harder for you to see this technique. So it might be nice to start it down at this lower level, but it also might be nice to say, well, you don't have control over your resources right away, so you start with just overall limiting the work of the team and see what happens. See, so it's something you can experiment with at either end, either as you're much more mature in your Kanban processes and you just don't need to be that prescriptive because you know the team will self-balance and that will work if you have a good track record of doing that. On the other side, if you are just getting started and you don't have the capability of load balance in your team right away, you can just start to impose a work in process limit at this higher level, start to get some of the value out of seeing what the team does when they're doing less fragmentation and less work in process. So it's a good tool for a lot of different uses. Alrighty, at this point I'm going to take a breath. I rarely do that. And see what you guys have in the way of questions, because we're going to move into just probably pretty quickly walking through some examples of boards in the wild. And again, these are the examples here are going to be to get your creative juices flowing, get you thinking about how other teams are solving some board challenges. And maybe that gives you ideas for how you might solve challenges of your own. Not as detailed. These boards are all going to have stories behind them, and I don't know all the stories behind them, actually. But again, just give you some ideas, and then we'll wrap up. So this one is my colleague Stephen Borg's personal Kanban board in his office at Northwest Cadence. It's been evolving, and the deal with him is just the nature of his job is such that he is almost always running around doing a lot of different unexpected things. And he is the guy whose role at our company is to take on stuff when it pops up. The rest of us appreciate that because it lets us stay heads down and focused on the things that we are doing. So he's sort of the interruption filter. He takes it all on. In order for him to keep all the stuff going that he is managing at any given time, he's got this Kanban board, and he's using some very cool color coding. So as you might expect, the pink ones that come up are the things that have come up just today that need to be done right away. I think the green ones are the, like, do this week, and then the yellow ones are do any old time. So he's got a backlog, he's got to-dos, he's got his in-process, do these today, stuff that he is in process doing, stuff he is waiting on, and things that are done. It's nice, by the way, in all of the boards that we've been looking at, it is awfully nice to preserve an area for done for at least a while, rather than just saying as soon as they're done, we take them completely off the board. And the reason it's nice to do that is it's awfully nice to let your team see what they have accomplished and be reminded that it's not just all about the work that is coming at them, but that they have achieved things. It's also good for your executives to see that your team has achieved things. So you may keep done things on the board for a period of time, or perhaps they stay there until everything goes to production and then you clear that part of the board. Stephen tells the story, we don't have a picture of it unfortunately, of a team that he worked with who had a done column, and then over here in the far right, they had a beer column. And I don't think every story made it into the beer column, but that was we got a particularly difficult and hairy story done, and so we've got it into the done column. We're going to move it into the celebrate, drink some beer, that was awesome that we got that story done column. So think about different, again, that's the team taking ownership of their board too. Ways for your team to reflect that stuff that's important to them. Alrighty, another example. So this is an example of an electronic board and a way to make an electronic board visible to everybody and really successful. My absolute favorite two things about the board should be obvious. And this one is clearly stuff that is of interest to a technical team, so it's using a technical tool. You've got specifically coding work that's going on, work that's being done to code. You've got your build history here, passes and fails, so you've got it wired in with your continuous integration. Continuous integration and build servers, when they first came out, people used to talk about, I know they actually were doing it, putting a big police light on top of the server that would go off if the build broke. That's another means of a big visible display, right? It's something that's informative, it's concise, it tells a story, it gets your attention, it makes you want to go fix the build. So this is the evolution of that. We look at, it's a little bit more grown up. I like the big light better. Of course, my favorite thing is, this is the guy who last broke the build. That's just delightful. And then I don't know why there's a picture of Magnum PI over here, but I think it's a good idea. The only thing that would be a bummer is that if your team cleans up their builds and they do a really nice job of rarely breaking the build, your picture could be up here for months if you're the one who's done it. Maybe then you think about putting something different in that section, or maybe you just all appreciate that, hey, I've been up there for 3 months because we never break the build, and that in itself is a reason to celebrate. Whatever it takes. The other thing is, of course, this is a thing that not everybody has resources to be able to do, but it is a way to make an electronic board something visible to everybody because they put it on a big screen. Dedicated. Alrighty, this is actually it's not exactly the same board as is on the new TFS, Team Foundation server, but it is pretty much the same. I've been working with, if you have an invitation for TFS preview, their service built in the cloud, you get a board that looks a lot like this. The Team Foundation server web app looks a lot like this. They've made a few cosmetic changes, like this plus looks different now, but it's basically the same. And as you can see from the picture, it is drag and droppable. So this is another version of an electronic board, and we've got here, basically it's a story level item broken down into tasks. The tasks, what I noticed right away is that they've put a prefix on some of them to make them stand out as being a certain flavor of task, and that's always useful to know. And then you can drag them from this. It doesn't have the headings on here, but this is your to-do, in progress, and done. And since it's TFS, they're also measuring, you've got your hours remaining on all of these little guys, and you've got a nice little Scrum remaining work / burn down graph that's being built here, and who these things are assigned to. So completely cool how all that works. I think it's interesting too that they've got the subteams as users that things can be assigned to, so that's a good use of that tool. Here we have a physical board in the world, and this is a pretty straightforward example of a board. You've got your backlog, and it looks to me like this is a Scrum team, right? So they've got their sprint backlog starting up, breaking down stuff into tasks and getting them done over some period of time. And what is that? That looks like that says in progress. I see. So this is their task breakdown during sprint planning. That makes a lot of sense. These are the tasks that are actually being worked on. Don't know what that is. Maybe testing and done. So that's super cool. And then they've got somebody sticks up the printout of the burn down chart every day on the board, which is also cool. So you can see where there's no reason at all that you can't use a good Kanban visible display as a tool to help you manage a sprint in Scrum. There's nothing incompatible about these at all. You just would have the columns and the layout of the board would be reflective of your Scrum process. But in Scrum, the work that's done within the sprint, between sprint planning and sprint review, that isn't prescribed by anything in particular. The team owns how that work gets done. They own what the little column headings would be. Scrum doesn't tell you that stuff. So that's actually a good thing in my book. That gives you a lot of flexibility to work for the team the way the team wants to work. And so all of those patterns that we looked at are potentially in play, even if you're doing Scrum. Here we have an example, I think, of some sub-teams or some different teams working on different types of work. So this is lots of different boards, but they're all up in a place where you can see, kind of get an idea of a big picture. What I like about this board is that the team is showing ownership of the board, right? So I think a good pattern when you recognize that you are doing your board really well, you will start to see the team not just engaging with it, not just having ownership of it, but really kind of playing with it and making it fun. Because at the heart of it, it is a communication tool for your team. So if the most important thing for the team today is to wish one of their members a happy birthday, I like the get older one in progress. If that's important to the team to do that day, they should do it. And when you see the team having fun with the board, it also tells you that they aren't seeing the board as drudgery and they don't see the board as a punishment. So those are really good signs that your team is doing something well. If they're only playing with the board, that might be a different problem. But if they're both getting work done and having fun engaging with the board, I think that's a good thing. So you should really encourage it. Doodling, artwork, playing around with stuff, making fun of each other, whatever it is that is working for them, good-natured stuff should be encouraged. It doesn't need to be too serious. Alrighty, another board, taking advantage of space available without ruining the view. I think this is brilliant. Here we have, what do we got here? Nice. So this is, looks like, this one looks a little bit, yeah, so the deal is I don't know what all the stories are from these boards because they're not all from clients or blogs of mine. But we've got our people down here represented with cute pictures. Again, doesn't have to be all that hard. I like that it's got these kinds of details down here. So you've got like your capacity planning is here, and you understand that that's going to happen. We used to have a benched section on our Kanban board, so if we had any of our little South Park avatars who weren't working on a task because they were out of office or sick or on leave or something like that, we had a little benched area where they would go and sit, and it was our way of saying they're still part of the team. We're not taking them off the board and hiding them away. We're still seeing them. Oh, they've got Canute, so cute little polar bear right there. I also like that bugs are bug-shaped on this board, so that's cool. You know that there's loads of clever colors and shapes of Post-it notes that you can get. 3M does not give me a commission for telling you that, and they really should. But there's lots of different stuff that you can do, again, that tells a story. So you can use shapes as well as colors as indicators, and that can help be ways for your team to understand. All right, and here's a board that a lot of folks are actually already familiar with, but it's another way of being a Kanban board. A lot of families use task boards for their kids because that everyday visibility, everyday interaction, setting a routine, making these things expected and not punishments, all of that adds a lot of value. And you can use, heck, it helps teach your kids how to read. And who doesn't want to teach developers how to read, right? So you've got color coding, you've got ways for your kids to understand what it is that they're expected to do at any given time. And you can, of course, have stickers and stars and happy faces and things on there to indicate that they are done with whatever they are done with for that day. Good stuff on there. So this is, again, something that a lot of folks are already doing. And you're not, doesn't mean you're treating your developers like toddlers, even when they deserve it. I say as a developer, but that you are bringing in tools that you already know how to use to communicate effectively. Alrighty, so this is the danger of the Kanban board. We're going to move into wrapping it up, being done for the day. I do want to talk about, this is my, the concern that I have with a lot of teams that are getting started with Kanban. So I started the talk by explaining that visualizing your work means that you start where you are. And that is fairly important to do because you want your boards to be true, you want your team to be engaged, you want them to have ownership of the process, you want to understand what the team really is doing in order to be able to make effective changes. But if all you do is visualize your work today, even if you do that really well, that would be, if all you do is the first step, and you don't follow up or you don't know what to do for the next step, which is now that you've visualized it, how can you make it better? Where are the problem areas? How can you solve common things that come up? If you don't, as a team, commit to doing that continuous improvement, you don't necessarily get over here to profit. There isn't necessarily an automatic path to you visualize things and then you become more productive. You do have to work at it. So it's important to understand that that is just the first step. And so things you might then choose to do to leverage your visible display, what might your next steps be, would be look for places that work is queuing up. Look for places where things are sitting for a while and not moving. How come they're not moving? Is it because the next person is not ready to take them on? Why is that? Is it because you don't have enough of the next person? Is it because they're not, they don't have all the tools they need to do whatever that step is efficiently? This can happen everywhere. A lot of times we think of that as happening between development and test. I think a lot of teams have issues with testing resources, but it can also happen earlier on if you have analysts that are cranking out detailed requirements or specifications much faster than the development team can possibly implement them. That is also a wasteful, non-lean activity, and you want to look at opportunities for your analysts to do less and wait for things to get developed and get feedback on the quality of the requirements that they wrote, exactly the same way as your dev team should get feedback on the quality of their code. So those are places to start to look to make improvements. What do you want to do? Where do you want to target? And then you go from there. And you have to be able to do the next step of empowering your team to think up solutions and try solutions. This is where a technique, plan, do, check, act, try something out, look at the result, see if it's what you like, verify that you want to keep doing it, or stop doing it and do something else. Finally, these are some takeaways for you guys for your board. So as you are thinking about either setting up a board or improving a board that you already have, some quick guidelines. Focused, simple, visual. We talked about all of those things. Again, simplifying things so that they tell the story. I guess, telling your story is what all of this comes down to. I mentioned at the top that I added something just before today's session, which was this guy right here. Keep the board moving. That's what that living in the earlier slide was about as well. Your team should be taking things off the board and moving them from one place to another at least every day, several things. If that's not happening, and it's okay if you start out and that's not happening, because what did you do? You started where you are. If you're not doing that right away, one of the things you might look at as an opportunity is, can we make this board move by breaking down some of these very large things that sit in the yes, I'm still working on it state for 4 days, 5 days, a week? Can we break that down into, okay, fine, but what are you going to do today? How much of that are you going to get done today? Put that on a sticky, and then we can move it at the end of the day. Start rewarding your folks for getting those little milestones done. Developers especially are going to be cranky about that at first because they're going to feel like it's not really done. I only did a day's worth of work. Make them let you celebrate it anyway. So, and keep it real, I think, is also really important. Don't put stuff up there that is misleading, and don't put stuff up there that is meaningless. If it's not something that lends itself well to being visualized, don't try to visualize it. The quote is that if you can't measure what you can manage, then you will try to manage what you can measure, and that will distort your priorities as well. So you really do want to keep it focused on what is most important. Not the process itself, but what lends itself to getting the value out the door to the customer most effectively. So with all of that, I want to thank you guys so much for joining us today. Again, I am Cheryl. There's a little bit of my contact information. You can also find I blog. I do some other, I haven't blogged in ages, but I do some other stuff. I would love to hear from all